Okay, so we're going to shift gears into the American Revolution. And this is the one that you all are probably the most familiar with, and I'm not going to spend an intense amount of time on it. So, the American Revolution is not necessarily caused by this demand for freedom, right? Because we're not seeing this push for the abolition of slavery. We're not even really seeing this big push for equality among the people or among men. Those founding fathers come from this background of wealth. They are not individuals that are considered poor or even of common status. Their frustration stems from basically now having to pay specific taxes and never having previously had to have paid a direct tax to Britain before. And so they are going to have to do that now. So again, we have to look at those concepts of freedom and equality in the context of the time. They are looking for equality as far as noble or the wealthiers having equality under law, feeling as if they have been kind of kept back from progress because they've been forced to pay various taxes, etc. But again, looking at it from that construct rather than this understanding of what we see freedom as today. And then they are going to push for specific freedoms. So when we see eventually the effects of the revolution, we'll see kind of the freedoms that they're pursuing. So Britain had passed the Navigational Act, basically demanding that the American colonists, or the British colonists really at the time, the colonists are going to have to pay or only be able to trade with Britain. Now, this is a policy for Britain that is mercantilism, and is actually a pretty important policy that you have more exports than you have imports. So it's going to bring more profit to the British treasury, but it's going to frustrate the colonists because they feel like they should be able to trade with other countries and not be limited to the British, especially when the British goods in some cases are more expensive than goods they can get elsewhere. So that's a frustration. Britain is going to become involved in the French and Indian War, otherwise known as the 7 Years' War. This is really just kind of this after effect of years of war that had been evident between Britain and France, and ultimately leads into Britain receiving a significant amount of territory in the Americas, a huge portion of Canada, and other territories as well, kind of in Appalachia. So this leads into the French becoming very bitter, and that's going to play a role later. But war is very expensive. And so, in order to gain support by the colonists to help fight this war, the British promised that they would be able to move west. And so the war ends. The colonists had been successful, obviously, with Britain. And Britain is now in a massive amount of debt. They have to pay back. So, hey, like we had to fight this war for you in the Americas, you should be the rightful ones to pay the taxes. Well, the colonists are frustrated with that because no, this was kind of your war that we got involved in. And on top of which, the British had created the Proclamation Line of 1763. This proclamation line said that the colonists would not move further west. And so the colonists feel like this is a direct attack because part of the reason or part of the purpose that they had gotten involved in this war was that they had the ability to move west. They had the freedom to move west. And Britain, kind of recognizing this is going to cause conflict with the native populations that live west, establishes that proclamation line and says you're not crossing this area, right? This is the expectation. So the colonists are very frustrated. Not only have we fought this war kind of with this understanding that we'll have this ability to move further west, but now you're also demanding increased taxation and keeping us from moving west. And so various events are going to occur. And so on that right hand side you can kind of see different types of acts. You have the Stamp Act, you have the Sugar Act, you have the Townsend Duties, you have the Tea Act, which is not actually an increase in taxation on tea, but rather, again, kind of this idea that you're only going to buy tea from us. And so Britain had actually lowered the cost of tea because the colonists had been smuggling it in. And so this frustrates them because the colonists understand that this is a political move to get the colonists to purchase tea from the British. So that leads into the Boston Tea Party, where they dump the tea into the harbor. And so then the British respond with the Intolerable Acts, which were also known as the Coercive Acts, because this was an attempt to kind of say, no, and it's really a punishment on Boston because of their involvement, or or Massachusetts, because of their involvement in kind of leading these challenging moves. So they have the First Continental Congress. Again, they're not pushing for freedom, right? They're not pushing for freedom from Britain. At this point, they're trying to figure out this means of reconciliation. But shortly after that, you see Lexington and Concord, which is in 1775, where first shots are fired. And so now we start seeing this idea of this is unacceptable, right? Now we actually are in war. And so in the Second Continental Congress, we start seeing this movement towards writing this Declaration of Independence. And, if you really look at Thomas Jefferson versus John Locke, it's very, you could say Jefferson violated the honor code here too. So he is going to take many of the ideas that John Locke had and apply them. And the Declaration of Independence is really where the colonists are saying, we're done. It's kind of this breakup letter, but he lays it out pretty clearly and says, this is what has been done wrong, and this is kind of what we're doing about it. And so those ideas of freedom and equality are found in the Declaration of Independence. So he has that claim, all men are created equal. Now, again, we have to understand context with this, because we also know that he's not talking about black men. He's not talking about indigenous men. He is not talking about necessarily your very poor men, and he's not talking about women, right? So pretty exclusion based as far as that idea is. He also has that life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, where John Locke had life, liberty, and property. And so we start seeing that these Enlightenment ideas and this concept of freedom to a certain degree is evident. And then this idea of equality, again, equality under law, but an equality that is not going to reach out to other groups of people. So the revolution continues. Kind of this whole idea of how did we win, right? You have this ragtag group of men who fight under George Washington. They're struggling, and it doesn't seem like we're going to be very successful. But there's different things that help. George Washington is able to rally different men, even those that are poor and have no military background. And he's very successful in that. But one of the biggest things that will help the colonists is that France jumps in. And France kind of waits. They sit back and kind of see, are the colonists going to be successful? And when they realize that there is potential after the Battle of Saratoga, the French step in. And that support is pivotal in leading to the success of the colonists. It's also very expensive for the British. They're having to send the military overseas, and they don't necessarily know the land. So the American Revolution ends with Lord Cornwallis surrendering to George Washington, and supposed to be the creation of the United States. Now, when you get into U.S. history next year, you're going to learn a little bit more about how Britain continues to challenge this idea of the United States of America, leading into that Second War for Independence, or what they call the War of 1812. But none of this necessarily, like French support, doesn't come from these ideas of equality or freedom. It comes because of that bitterness from the French and Indian War. So the effects. They are going to relate to the freedom ideas, or those constructs of freedom and equality, the constructs of the time. The Articles of Confederation are written and very weak. There is not a strong executive branch. The states hold the majority of the power. There is no way to effectively collect taxes, and farmers are becoming very resentful because they are paying heavier taxes from the cost of war. So again, we're looking at equality under law, but those of more powerful means. And so Shays' Rebellion breaks out. The government is really unable to kind of respond to this effectively, and so they realize that they need to come together and meet, and they establish the Constitution. And the Constitution reflects those ideas of freedoms and equality again. to a certain degree. They do have this idea of checks and balances that we would have seen with Montesquieu from the Enlightenment. We have federalism where you have roles that the federal government plays, but then there's also levels of government that exist with the states. And so there is an attempt to kind of deal with the conflict or this pressure of should states have more power, should the federal government have more power? And so if something is to come into conflict, then with it, like if states are to come into conflict with the federal government, and the federal government will win. But if it's not specifically cited in the Constitution, it's a state power. So there's various issues there, and that all kind of gets debated in the Federalist Papers that you see Hamilton and Jay kind of write. But the Bill of Rights is where we see this idea of freedom and equality, because we have the freedom of speech, the freedom of religion, the right to petition, the right to assemble. All of these things are the First Amendment in the Bill of Rights. So we know that this is something that the founding fathers are considering. Again, these are something that typically relates to free white men. We know that there is still slavery. The Constitution, when kind of writing the Constitution, they don't even want to talk about it for years. And then they come up with the Three-Fifths Compromise saying that slaves are not even going to be considered a full person. And again, an idea of property. So there is equality, but it's more so political equality. It's not going to be equality in our sense of having true equality in society. So that's going to have to be something that comes later because, again, all of the founding fathers had slaves. There's a huge scandal with Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings. So the other part, though, is those freedoms and having these ideas of freedom of speech. And then as the country goes on, protecting those freedoms. So that is evident. But again, those freedoms are strictly kind of focused initially on those free white men. Because we obviously know that an enslaved person or even somebody that was of a different color didn't necessarily have the same freedom of speech that someone else did. So those ideas are going to be ingrained in kind of this American Revolution, and then the American Revolution will help lead into the French Revolution, or at least have an impact on it.